I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, anti-Semitism is alive and well in the halls of the United Nations, as UNESCO formally adopted a resolution to remove all Jewish names of historical places in the State of Israel and on the West Bank. In essence, what the Jewish people have always referred to as Eretz Yisrael, and which history has recorded as biblical and post-biblical Jewish places in the Middle East, are no longer recognized by the Jewish world and the world as a whole as Jewish. It's as if, in some frighteningly Orwellian fashion, the United Nations has totally erased and rewritten the history of the Middle East, in direct contradiction to the factual, archaeologically verified Jewish presence in the land of Israel. The UN resolution was put forward by Algeria, Egypt, Lebanon, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, and Sudan. The original impetus, these Arab states claimed, was to eliminate any Jewish reference to what has always been called the Temple Mount, that large mound that sits atop the Western Wall in Jerusalem, where some 900 years before the start of the Common Era, King Solomon built the first Jewish temple as God's home on earth. And when that first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE by the Babylonians, it was rebuilt as the second temple some 50 years later under the leadership of Nehemiah. The second temple would also be destroyed, this time by the Romans in the year 70 CE, when Rome sacked Jerusalem. Jewish tradition now teaches that the temple will be built only with the coming of the Messiah. And it was not until the end of the 7th century, more than 600 years later, that a Muslim mosque was built on the Temple Mount called the Dome of the Rock, so named because the mosque sits on a large rock, which Jewish tradition says was where Abraham was told not to sacrifice his son, and where Muslim tradition says the Prophet Muhammad rose to heaven on his horse, though history records that Muhammad never visited Jerusalem even one time during his entire lifetime. And yet the UN is prepared to wipe out any reference to the Jewish history of the first and second temple on the Temple Mount and to rename it for the world with Muslim names alone. The vote was 24 in favor, including Iran, only 6 against, including the United States, Great Britain, Germany, and the Netherlands, with 26 abstentions, including 17 nations which had previously been in favor of the resolution. Those abstaining included France, India, Argentina, Spain, Sweden, Sri Lanka, Guinea, and Togo. And it should be noted that not one European country voted in favor of this anti-Semitic resolution. In the last decades, the United Nations, which once affirmed the Jewish right to a sovereign Jewish state in the land of Palestine, that same United Nations, which in 1947 voted in favor of a partition plan that would create a Jewish state alongside an Arab state, has become painfully myopic when it comes to Israel, at one point defining the Jewish people's return to our ancient homeland as racist, and now literally, not figuratively, now literally, defining the historical Jewish connection to Eretz Yisrael out of existence. Every person with any sense of decency, moral integrity, should be outraged at this UN decision, which was initiated by its special agency based in Paris called UNESCO, which stands for the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, which was created to promote, among other things, cultural reforms meant to increase the universal respect for justice, the rule of law, and human rights. How in the world does wiping out 4,000 years of Jewish history and ties to the land of Israel increase respect for justice, the law, and human rights? Well, to speak to this most upsetting development at the UN, I am so pleased to have back on JBS a man who has a most impressive and distinguished career of public service as a national diplomat, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who served as Jimmy Carter's chief political policy advisor and executive director of the White House Domestic Policy Staff. He was also Deputy Treasury Secretary under Bill Clinton, and he was the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. Stuart Eizenstat also has a most impressive record of service to the world Jewish community, being responsible for the Washington Conference on Holocaust-era Assets, which helped to reclaim Jewish art that had been stolen by the Nazis. Among his many awards, Stuart is a recipient of Israel's Courage and Conscience Award, and currently Stuart Eizenstat practices international law with the Washington law firm of Covington. And Stuart joins us on our JBS phones now from Washington, D.C. Stuart, it's a pleasure to welcome you back to JBS.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's unfortunate that it's this resolution that brings us back together.
Yes. All right, Stuart, what is your personal reaction to the UN's voting to eliminate Jewish names from places in Israel?
Well, they even went beyond that, Mark, and there was a long list of alleged actions, all of which were unfounded, claiming, for example, that Israel demolished and removed Islamic period remains on the Temple Mount. But my reaction is one of just disgust. And interestingly, the UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, rejected this resolution, saying that all three religions, including Judaism, have legitimate claims to this area. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, the Director General of the very organization, UNESCO, which voted for it, Irina Bokova, herself distanced it. Now, what does this mean, and why is this happening?
Yes.
It's very much part of the insidious effort to delegitimize Israel, to remove its legitimate right to claim its historic relationship to its homeland going back 2,500 years. Mm-hmm. It's part and parcel of the boycott, divestment, and sanction process, the BDS process, which I would call here BDS writ large. And every forum is being used, whether it's college campuses, whether it is, in effect, trying to get corporations to divest, whether it's getting pension funds to unload their stock in Israeli companies, or even, Mark, in American companies, I know this for a fact, that have any business in the West Bank. Mm-hmm. So it's really part and parcel of this whole delegitimization issue. But there's another equally troubling factor. And you mentioned it when you mentioned the countries that had voted yes or abstained or opposed. Only a handful of countries actually opposed it. And so you have countries like France and Argentina that abstained.
Yes.
Now, why did they do that rather than oppose?
Yes.
And this is the second troubling factor other than the resolution itself and the delegitimization effort, and that is it's reflecting a broader problem in Europe, and I was ambassador to the European Union during the Clinton administration, and that is that there is a growing number, perhaps now 15 million Muslims in Europe, and they are a growing political force. In Belgium, 10%, in France, 10%, in places like Amsterdam, 15%, and that has a political implication. So the abstention comes because the leaders of those countries, including Hollande and Prime Minister Valls, who's generally very pro-Israel, did not want to do something that might offend a significant voting faction in their country. And so this is another problem that we have to be concerned with, and that is the simple pressure of the growth of the Islamic population in these countries. They have a right to be there, but this is, in effect, the consequence of their growing political clout.
By the way, this is a digression for one moment. but the makeup of the Islamic population in Europe, in a France, for example, how different is it from the Muslim population that is now in the United States? American Muslims don't seem in any way to be as angry or to be leading attempts to do BDS here in America. And is it only a function of numbers, Stuart, or do you feel there's a real difference in character between the Islamic population of Europe and the American Muslim community?
Mark, you know, I think that the Census Bureau, while it is permitted to ask questions about race, ethnicity, religion, is not one of those they're permitted to ask. So when we have our figures, which we get from the Pew Foundation and from UGA studies, of what the Jewish population is in the United States, it really varies widely, and it depends on how people identify themselves.
Exactly.
But, roughly, in the United States, there are probably somewhere between 5 and 6.5, maybe even 7 million Jews.
Yes.
In the United States, the Muslim population is certainly upwards of 1 million, and heavily concentrated in places like the Detroit area. But you've pointed to a very important point, and that is, by and large, the Muslim population is much more integrated, much more accepted. The United States is, after all, a country of immigrants. We really pat ourselves on the back, and rightly so, for our diversity, for our tolerance, and that's a very different situation. And I know this from having lived in Europe as ambassador to the EU and going back to Europe very frequently. I was recently back in France, for example, and I'll be in Belgium next month. And that is, those are much more, Mark, homogeneous countries. They even see themselves as quote-unquote Christian countries. Political parties in Germany, for example, Chancellor Merkel's party is a Christian Democratic party. So they are not used to the diversity we have, and the Muslims there are not as well integrated as they are in the United States.
Okay, that's very helpful. All right, come back to the issue. Stuart, what's the practical consequence of this resolution? How will it be seen? How will it be manifest?
In a practical sense, there probably isn't any. I mean, this is simply a matter of words. It doesn't have any legally binding impact. Israel is not required to do anything in response to it, nor is the United States or anyone else. But it is something we should not discard lightly as just words, even though it has no legal effect, because it adds another drop to the constant dribble that we get day in and day out of delegitimization.
Yes.
And again, in so many different fora, and here you have this in the UN. I mean, there is in the UN, and there has been almost since its founding, it's one of the few special committees of any non-country. There's a special committee, for example, on the Palestinian rights.
Exactly.
And the UN Human Rights Council, a misnomer if there ever was one, a disproportionate percentage of their resolutions for human rights violations are on Israel.
Yes.
The only democracy in the region, not Iran, not China, not Russia, not the Congo, but Israel. So it's all part and parcel of this broader pattern of delegitimization, but this strikes very directly at it, because it's one thing to say, well, we don't like settlements, the settlements from Palestinian land. It's quite another to say Jews really don't have a right to declare this as their homeland at all. It's like the UN made a mistake in 1947 when they created a Jewish state and an Arab state out of the British Mandate, saying, in effect, well, they have no connection to the state, no historical connection. Now, you mentioned in your introduction, rightly so, the clear archaeological connection, but it's obviously not just the Temple Mount. I mean, anyone who's traveled extensively, and I've probably gone to Israel close to 50 times, you know, there are constant digs in every part of the country, unearthing ancient synagogues and other signs of the Jewish presence going back thousands of years before there were Palestinians. So the attachment historically is very important. It's not just that Israel was created in a reflexive emotional reaction to the Holocaust, and that suddenly they decided to make it the UN in 1947 Israel. It is that this was indeed the historical homeland of Jews for 2,500 to 3,000 years. And this is an effort by this resolution to delegitimize that historical connection.
A couple of quick questions come to my mind as a result of your saying this. I want to just finish the first thought. Is it possible, Stuart, that the United Nations will begin printing maps that only have the names of Muslim places in the Middle East?
Well, that's a very good question, Mark. It is certainly possible that UNESCO might do that, but for the United Nations, I think, given the quite strong condemnation, and to his credit, of outgoing Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, I don't think that the world's maps are going to be rewritten.
Okay, that's what was worrying me. Now, when you talk again about the way in which all of the archaeological finds, and there, as you say, anybody who's traveled to Israel, either they've gone on a dig or they've passed by a dig in progress. And whether you're in Hebron, whether you're in Jerusalem, whether you're in anywhere you go, there is constantly, we're finding more and more real living evidence of the extent to which Jews made their home in this country for years, generations, for thousands of years. You were in the state, you were in government, you were talking to people all the time. When you were inside American government, what did you say to each other when the Arab world kept saying there's no Jewish connection? And what do you say to yourself now? How is it possible that an intelligent Palestinian, somebody who has gone, they may have been educated at Harvard or at Oxford, and now they're back in Palestine. They're Palestine. How do you think they explain what is so clearly factual archaeological evidence and secondary evidence as well in writings that are contemporaneous to the time that the Israelites, children of Israel, Jewish people, lived in the land that was called Judea and then called Palestine? How is it possible that intelligent, thinking Arabs and Palestinians discount all of the archaeological evidence and the digs that you referred to as if none of this ever happened?
Well, Mark, it's really the big lie. They simply disregard the facts. And this is not a factual debate on their part. It's a political effort to delegitimize the state and to further their own political goals. That's truly what it's all about. I mean, they're not trying to marshal archaeological data any more than the BDS campaign does. It is purely a political effort, and in this case, again, a particularly insidious one, because it goes to the very root of the connection of the Jewish people to the state of Israel going back 2,500 to 3,000 years. So it's not a factual archaeological. It's a political decision that they've made. And the terrible thing is that they've been able to get it this far and get 25 countries to agree to support it.
Yes, and what you're suggesting is that 23 countries either don't know enough or are willing to participate in what you call the big lie. And we've seen how the big lie can work, whether it was in Nazi Germany, in South America. If you repeat a lie often enough, we've learned the lie begins to have a life of its own, yes?
Yes, and so it's really interesting that if you look at the countries that initiated this resolution, Egypt is one of them. Now, Sisi, the president of Egypt, has been exemplary in his intelligence coordination with Israel, shutting down the tunnels to Gaza, striking at terrorists, and making common cause in many ways with Israel. And yet, he feels enough pressure at home to be able to do what he can simply say, well, it's just a throwaway. We're going to continue to do things on the ground that are more important. But it's a way of suggesting that these countries who initiated it and supported it, and even those who abstain, feel under such domestic pressure that they're willing to participate in a big lie.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned very accurately, Mark, we learned from World War II and from the Nazis and from our enemies before and after. If you tell a lie enough times and it's not rebutted, it becomes an accepted fact. And
yes.
so that's why it's important for Israel, and not just for Israel, but for scientists and archaeologists around the world, to immediately disclaim this,
mm-hmm.
to cite their own factors. One of the mistakes one can make in a situation like this is to say, it's so absurd, certainly no one will believe it. That's a terrible mistake.
Yes.
You have to attack even the most absurd allegations, particularly when they rise to the level of a UN agency.
Yes. By the way, that's why it's also very important that people hear you on JBS. You're helping to make sure people understand it is a lie. Stuart, could the United States have done anything more to have stopped this UNESCO resolution from being passed?
No, I think that the administration did make an effort to delay it and to get as many countries, I know that they did, to oppose it, or at the very least to abstain. But we don't control UNESCO. It's not like the Security Council where we have a veto. This is a semi-independent agency of the UN.
Yes.
Where our influence is not the same as it is in the Security Council, where we can oftentimes delay a vote, or if worse comes to worse, veto the resolution. There you have 5 permanent and 9 temporary members, and there we can really put individual pressure on because the resolutions can be legally binding. Here, I think we did everything possible. Now, importantly, and to their credit, the Hillary Clinton campaign put out a very strong statement from Laura Rosenberg, which says it's outrageous that UNESCO would deny the deep historic connection between Judaism and the Temple Mount. As Secretary of State, Hillary fought to defend Israel against biased resolutions like these at the United Nations and other international organizations, and would proudly do so as president. So it's important that our political leaders, like Hillary, also take a strong position. Again, we simply can't let this kind of thing just be like water off a duck's back and say, oh, no, nobody will take it seriously.
And by the way, I just want to say, you and I are not talking politics today, and I don't want to be criticized for not talking about Trump. This is not the topic.
Well, I hope he'll make a statement too. I think we should be bipartisan. This is not a partisan issue. It's important that both sides and that all people of goodwill, Republican and Democrat, castigate this, and I think and hope they will.
Because you were the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, is it significant that UNESCO is based in Paris, or is that really incidental and has no impact at all?
No, it's incidental that it's based in Paris. What is not incidental is that very few members of the European Union voted against this resolution. Very few. And one of the ones that did, the UK, it won't be in it for very long.
Exactly right. Okay. So, Stuart, how do you feel today, in general, about the United Nations? From your perspective, is it still a legitimate world body that represents the ideals and principles upon which it was founded?
In general, I think the UN has a very important role to play and plays a very important role. For example, in conflict resolution and the blue helmets, there are thousands and thousands around the world that are helping to tamp down resolutions. In the end, however, Michael, the UN can only do what its member states back home want it to do. Even the United Nations Security Council, which, for example, passed 4 to 5 sanction resolutions against Iran, which helped bring it to the negotiating table. So there are many important things that that the UN does. But in the end, it depends, again, on the will of the member states. And that's what's so confounding and disturbing about this UNESCO resolution.
Yes.
It's not, quote-unquote, the UN. It is the countries who made up UNESCO that took this kind of egregious action. But we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly.
The UN does a lot of good things, but it can be perverted by member states who use it for their own political purposes.
You know, Stuart, when Prime Minister Netanyahu recently spoke to the General Assembly, he suggested that there is a change occurring in attitudes towards Israel at the UN, that more countries are now prepared to embrace Israel, work with Israel on a number of technological programs that promote human welfare. Do you have any sense of what's going on in the UN as it relates to the state of Israel?
Well, I mean, first of all, the UN gives somebody like the Prime Minister a forum at the General Assembly each September to make their case. And that's important in and of itself. But there's no question that Israel is, I think, more diplomatically isolated than it's been in decades. There's no question about it, not just in the UN, but in general. You've got, for example, the European Union, to which I was ambassador, having passed what's a law. It's a binding law that all products that have any connection to the West Bank have to be labeled. Like there was something dangerous about the product.
Yes.
The EU has a massive research and development grant program. Israel is the third largest recipient and the single largest outside of EU countries because of its high-tech capabilities of those funds. We're talking about 500 to 600 million euros. And in the last renewal, last year, that program was precluded to give grants to any institutions that have operations, even if they're tiny, in the West Bank. So, I mean, this is a real problem. It's being taken up in serious forums where they are not just like UNESCO, where it's a non-binding resolution, but where you have legally binding things like in the European Union.
Stuart, it is always such a joy to speak to you. I can't tell you, kol hakavod to you for all the work you've done, both for the United States of America and for the Jewish world, and your sensitivity helps all of us. And I'm very grateful for the time. I hope that this new year, 5777, is a wonderful one for you and your family, and that we get to speak often. But thank you very, very much, Stuart.
Well, thank you. We're speaking, of course, on Sukkot, so I wish you Chag Sameach.
Thank you so very much. The thoughts of longtime American diplomat, Ambassador Stuart Eizenstat, who's now practicing international law with the Washington law firm of Covington. And this seems like a very simple, clear-cut issue. UNESCO, and in essence the United Nations, have buckled under some anti-Israel, anti-Semitic pressures. And just as the resolution equating Zionism with racism was overturned, every person of goodwill can only hope that this resolution will be similarly rescinded. And if there's any way for us to keep the spotlight on this hideous outrage, as Stuart Eizenstat just did, JBS will do just that. My thanks, as always, to our director, Sloan Copeland, production coordinator, Serge Goldberg, to our editor and playback manager, Dennis Golan and John McDevitt, to JBS's associate director, Dara Golub, and to the producer of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.